The night my grandmother's lawyer read her will out loud in our living room, my uncle laughed. Not a quiet, uncomfortable laugh, a real one. Loud enough that the attorney, a thin man named Mr. Aldridge who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, paused mid-sentence and looked up from his papers. My uncle didn't apologize. He just leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and said, "Well, that tracks." I was 31 years old, standing in the corner of my grandmother's house holding a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, and I remember thinking, I'm not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. I didn't. But I want to tell you what happened before that room and what happened after. My grandmother's name was Vivienne. Not the one in this story, she goes by something else now, but that's what we called her. Viv. She raised me from the time I was 9 years old, after my mother's accident left her unable to care for me full-time. I spent summers, holidays, and eventually my entire junior and senior year of high school living in her house in Asheville, North Carolina, a blue craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a garden she tended like it owed her something. She taught me how to balance a checkbook before I knew how to drive. She taught me that you don't sign anything you haven't read twice. She used to say, "Theodora, the world will try to move faster than your brain. Don't let it." Theodora, that's me. I go by Theo. My uncle, my mother's older brother, had a different relationship with Viv. He'd moved back into her house at 47 after a business venture in Charlotte collapsed. That was 3 years before she got sick. He brought his girlfriend, a woman I'll call by her role because she never earned a name in my mind, the girlfriend. She redecorated 2 rooms without asking. She used Viv's good china for takeout pizza. She referred to Viv's house as the property in conversation. My grandmother didn't complain. That's the thing about Viv. She watched. She kept her mouth shut, and she watched. And I didn't understand until much later that this was not passivity. It was documentation. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday. Viv had passed 11 days earlier, quietly, in the hospice room she'd chosen herself, a ground-floor suite with a window facing the garden. I was there. My uncle was not. He'd had something come up in Charlotte. He made it back the following morning, smelling like a hotel bar. The attorney arrived at 2 in the afternoon. There were 7 of us in the living room, my uncle and the girlfriend on the couch, my uncle's adult son, my cousin, who I'll call by his relationship to me because that's all he is, sitting on the armrest like he owned the place already. My mother in the wingback chair she'd been using since her mobility got worse, 2 of Viv's longtime friends from church seated near the fireplace, and me, standing near the kitchen doorway. I was standing because there was no seat left. No one had saved one for me. Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat. He explained that the will had been updated 14 months prior. My uncle made a small, satisfied sound at this, as though he knew something, and that Vivienne had been of sound mind and clear intention at the time of signing, with 2 witnesses and a notarized certification from her physician. He began to read. The personal items went first. Jewelry to my mother, the church piano to the congregation, a painting to one of Viv's friends, who started crying before he finished the sentence. Then the house. The blue craftsman bungalow with the wraparound porch. The garden. The half-acre lot in the historical district, which I later learned was worth somewhere between $490,000 and $540,000, depending on the market. Mr. Aldridge said my name. Not my uncle's. Mine. The room went very still for about 2 seconds. Then my uncle laughed. "Well," he said, "that tracks." What happened next moved in a kind of slow-motion clarity I've only experienced a few times in my life. My cousin said, "There has to be a mistake." The girlfriend said she must not have been fully coherent when she signed it. My uncle stopped laughing and said something I'm not going to repeat here, directed at me, in front of my mother, in front of Viv's friends from church. In his dead mother's living room, my mother said quietly, "Please, don't." He turned to her, his own sister, in a wheelchair, 11 days after losing her mother, and said, "You knew about this, didn't you? You both planned this." My mother's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her knees. I watched all of this happen from the kitchen doorway. I hadn't moved. I hadn't said anything. My coffee cup was still in my hand, and I realized I was gripping it hard enough that it hurt. I set it down on the counter behind me. "Mr. Preston, Aldridge, bless this man," said in an absolutely even voice. "The document is valid, executed, and unambiguous. If anyone wishes to contest it, they are welcome to pursue that through the appropriate legal channels. I'd be happy to provide referrals." He slid his papers into his briefcase and clicked it shut. "I'll see myself out." He did. The room was left to us. "I want to tell you something about my uncle that I never said out loud until recently. He wasn't always like this. Or maybe he was, and I just didn't see it until I was old enough to look clearly. When I was little, he was the fun one. He took us to Carowinds. He did impressions that made Viv laugh so hard she had to sit down. He was the kind of person who knew how to make a room like him. But fun and good are not the same thing. I spent a lot of years confusing them. He had borrowed money from Viv twice in the past decade. The first time, $40,000, to cover payroll for the Charlotte business before it folded. Viv had never asked for it back. The second time, $18,000 for what he described as a personal matter. Also never repaid. I only know these numbers because Viv told me herself, calmly, one evening the previous spring when we were sitting on the porch after dinner. "I'm not angry," she said. "I made a choice each time, but I want you to know, because someday it's going to matter that you know." I filed that conversation away and didn't take it out until much later. The week after the will reading was the worst week of my adult life, which is saying something because I also lived through a layoff, a broken engagement, and a car accident on I-26 that I don't like to talk about. My uncle called me 4 times. I didn't answer. He texted 14 messages ranging from apologetic to threatening. I screenshotted everyone. The girlfriend showed up at the house, my house, technically, though it didn't feel like mine yet. While I was there going through Viv's papers, she knocked and then tried the door handle before I answered. It was locked. I watched her through the window for a moment before I opened it. She said she just wanted to talk through the situation. She said there were things I didn't understand about how much my uncle had contributed to the household. She said Viv had needed a lot of help the last few years, implying, without saying directly, that this help should be compensated. In real estate, I said, "I appreciate you stopping by." I closed the door. I stood in Viv's entryway with my back against the door for a long time, looking at the hallway she'd walked down 10,000 times, the wallpaper she'd chosen in 1987, the little table by the door where she kept her keys. Then I went back to the papers. Here is what I found in those papers. Viv kept records the way other people keep hobbies. Meticulous, dated, organized in labeled folders in a fireproof cabinet in her bedroom closet. There were folders for every major financial transaction going back 20 years. There was a folder labeled in her handwriting, "Loans Unreturned." Inside it, a signed personal loan agreement for the $40,000, another for the $18,000, both bearing my uncle's signature, both with payment schedules he had never followed. There was another folder, this one labeled "Property Concerns," inside it printed emails, a string of correspondence between my uncle and a real estate developer in Asheville, a company that had been quietly buying up craftsman properties in the historical district for the past 4 years. The emails dated back 18 months. My uncle had been in contact with them. He described Viv's house in detail. He had written, in his own words, in a sent email dated 8 months before she passed, "She won't live forever. I'm the likely heir. We can move on this within a year of her passing." I sat down on the floor of Viv's bedroom and read that email 3 times. Then I took out my phone. I didn't call anyone that night. I needed to think first. Viv had taught me that. Don't react. Respond. There's a difference. 3 days later, I made 2 calls and sent 1 email. The first call was to a probate and estate attorney in Asheville. Not Mr. Aldridge, a different firm that a friend from college had referred me to. I explained the situation. I scanned and emailed her the loan documents, the emails, the correspondence with the developer. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. She said, "This is more than I expected when you called." She said the loan documents, signed and dated, gave me legal standing to pursue repayment of roughly $58,000 from my uncle's estate share, which, in Viv's will, consisted of personal property and a small cash inheritance. The emails were a separate matter, but they established a pattern of intent that could be relevant if he chose to contest the will. We talked for an hour. By the end of it, I had a plan. The second call was to a financial advisor I'd been seeing since I was 28, a woman named Ms. Holt, who works out of a small office in Biltmore Village and does not sugarcoat things. I told her what I was sitting on. She asked me 7 questions in rapid succession, and then told me to make a specific appointment for the following Monday. The email was to my uncle. It was 4 sentences long. I said that I had retained legal counsel. I said that I had documentation related to 2 outstanding personal loans made by Vivienne. I said that I intended to pursue repayment through proper channels. I said that any further contact should be directed to my attorney. I hit send at 11:47 on a Thursday night. I made tea. I sat on Viv's porch in the dark and listened to the neighborhood. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more like quiet, like a decision had been made and the making of it was done, and now there was just the living through what came next. My cousin called me 2 days after the email. He was calmer than his father. He said he thought everyone was getting carried away and asked if we could meet for coffee and just talk it out like adults. I said, sure. We met at a place downtown. He ordered a latte. He spent the first 10 minutes explaining how hard the past few months had been for his dad, how the Charlotte situation had taken a lot out of him, how Viv's death had hit him harder than it looked. Then he said, you know she always meant for the house to eventually be shared. She told my dad that. I looked at him across the table. I said, did she put that in writing? He blinked. I said, because she put a lot of things in writing. I've been reading through them. It's actually very thorough. He picked up his latte. He put it back down without drinking it. I said, I'm not trying to take anything that isn't mine. I'm also not going to pretend that documents don't exist. We sat there for another few minutes. He asked if there was any flexibility on the loan situation. I said, that's a conversation for the attorneys. He left first. I finished my coffee. I paid for both of us because Viv raised me to do that, and I'm not going to stop being who I am because someone else decided to be something different. The legal process took 4 months. My uncle, through his own attorney, initially threatened to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence, meaning he intended to argue that I had manipulated an elderly woman into changing her will in my favor. My attorney filed a response that included the physician's certification of cognitive capacity, the 2 witness statements from the will signing, and a letter written by Viv herself, dated 16 months before her death, addressed to whomever this concerns, stating clearly and in her own unmistakable voice why she had made the decision she made. I didn't read that letter until after the settlement. I couldn't. I knew if I read it before I'd fall apart, and I needed to not fall apart. The contest was dropped. The loan repayment was settled at $41,000, less than the full $58,000, but my attorney had told me to expect a negotiated number and to consider it a reasonable outcome. The money went into an account I opened specifically for repairs and maintenance on the house. The developer my uncle had been emailing never made contact with me. I later found out, through a neighbor who follows local development news more closely than I do, that the company had pivoted to a different neighborhood. Whether my uncle had spoken to them in the interim, I don't know. I chose not to find out. Some things you close the folder on and put back in the cabinet. I moved into the house in January. I kept almost everything the way Viv had it. The wallpaper, the kitchen table, the garden, though I've had to learn from scratch because I never paid close enough attention when she was trying to teach me, and now I regret that every single time I kill a plant. My mother comes over on Sundays. She sits in the garden when the weather is good. We drink coffee and we talk about Viv more than we talk about anything else. And we both cry sometimes and we both laugh sometimes, and it's the closest thing to okay that I've found. My uncle and I have not spoken since the settlement. I don't know what we'll do with that eventually. I'm not ready to figure it out yet. Maybe I will be someday. Maybe Viv would want that. But Viv also kept a folder labeled Loans Unreturned. So I think she also believed in being honest about what things cost. Someone asked me recently, after I mentioned some of this to a friend who mentioned it to someone else, and suddenly people were asking, they said, "Don't you feel guilty taking the house when your uncle was living there?" I thought about it for a real minute before I answered, because I wanted to be honest and not just defensive. And then I said, my grandmother spent 64 years building something. She made a choice about who she trusted with it. I think the least I can do is trust her judgment. I'm Theo, I'm 31. I live in a blue craftsman bungalow in Asheville with a wraparound porch and a garden that's actively fighting me. And before I go, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if this story hits something in you, if you've ever been in a room where someone laughed at the wrong moment, let me know. You don't have to explain the whole thing. I'll understand. I've thought a lot about that laugh. My uncle's laugh, in his mother's living room, 11 days after she died. I've tried to figure out what kind of person laughs at that moment, and I keep coming back to the same answer. Someone who never expected consequences. Someone who had moved through enough of life getting away with things that consequence started to feel like a concept that applied to other people. That's not a judgment, it's just what I observed. Viv never raised her voice at him. Not once, in all the years I watched them together. And for a long time I read that as forgiveness, or maybe exhaustion. I understand now it was something more deliberate than either. She was a woman who believed that what you build matters more than what you say, and that the record you keep is the truest version of yourself you'll ever leave behind. She kept her folders, she kept her files, she kept her vials, she kept her mouth mostly shut, and she kept her eyes completely open. I think about that a lot when I'm tempted to react fast, to fire back, to make sure everyone in the room knows I'm not going to stand for something. There's a version of me, the younger version, the one who didn't know yet what patience actually costs, who would have said something in that living room, something sharp. Something that would have felt good for about 40 seconds and then made everything harder. I didn't. Not because I was the bigger person in some easy, self-congratulatory way, because I was genuinely too stunned to speak, and then by the time I could speak, Mr. Aldridge had already clicked his briefcase shut, and I realized the room had already said everything that needed saying without me opening my mouth once. What I've learned, what Theo learned, what I'm still learning, is that intelligence without patience is just noise. You can be the smartest person in a situation and still lose it completely because you moved before you understood what you were actually dealing with. Viv understood this. She didn't just keep records because she was organized. She kept records because she knew that someday someone would need to know the truth. And feelings fade, but documentation doesn't. The loan agreements my uncle signed weren't a trap, she said. They were just the natural result of her being someone who took things seriously. She took her son seriously enough to write down what he borrowed. She took herself seriously enough to make him sign it, and she trusted that the truth, kept carefully in a fireproof cabinet, would eventually be useful to someone. It was useful to me. I think the hardest thing about being treated unfairly by people you love, or people you thought you loved, is that it can make you want to become someone harder. Someone who stops trusting, someone who keeps their distance from everyone, just to be safe. I felt that pull. Especially that week after the will reading those emails from my uncle to the developer, seeing in plain language what he had assumed about her timeline, about her life, about what he was owed. But Viv didn't go hard. She went careful. There's a difference. Going hard closes things. Going careful keeps your options open and your integrity intact, and at the end of it, you can look at what you built and know it's actually yours. I'm still learning that. Some mornings I'm better at it than others, but I live in her house now, and I tend her garden badly, and every time I sit on that porch I think, she left me something harder to measure than a property value. She left me an example of how to move through the world when the world is not being fair to you. That's the thing I'm trying to keep.